Talk. I've only actually walked into one of these, and it was, I'm just going to say Dr. Phil's. So I have I have a hard bar to meet with this. But this is going to be a bit like drinking through a fire hose, because I've only done a paper recently, so I'm 1 year into a doctoral program, and so I'll have a ton of information, probably too much. We'll see if we even get to the end. But I suppose the best way to start is to share a little bit about the doctoral program, because honestly I think this program and what it is about will help explain to some degree why I'm studying what I'm studying, why I'm writing about what I'm writing about. So first of all, I'm working on my doctorate of ministry through Portland Seminary in Portland, Oregon. And it's called, the degree program is called the Doctor of Ministry in Semiotics, Church, and Culture. And I'm sure the church and culture you can figure out, but it's the semiotics part that a lot of people go, what in the world is that? But semiotics comes from the Greek word semeion, which is signs. So it's the study of signs, and that is not study of signs in the same way of Dan Brown has a semiotician in the Da Vinci Code. It's not that kind of signs, whereas that's more like logos and images. This is signs of culture, signs of times. What's going on? What's happening? Where have we been? Where might things be going? Along with church and along with culture. And a couple ways to talk about that, kind of the biblical, if you will, how to recognize the signs of church and culture. If you go to 1 Chronicles, there are, as in many places, a list of the 12 tribes of Israel, and each tribe has a job, right? The Levites in particular, right? Their job is to care for the temple. That's the priestly group, if you will, and when you tithe in the Hebrew Bible, the tithe goes to and through the Levites for the care of the temple. The Issacharians, tribe of Issachar, their job is to read the signs of the times and know what to do. Semioticians, to read the signs of the times. In other words, what's going on in the world and how are we as people of God to respond, to plug in, and to be. To read the signs of the times and know what to do. The second comes from Jesus. Does everyone has heard Red Sky at Night, Sailors? And that comes directly from Jesus. If you didn't know that. In both Matthew and Luke, that Jesus answers the disciples who are asking some questions. When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red, and again in the morning it will be stormy, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. In other words, you just keep doing what you're doing, but you're not paying attention. Your eyes are not wide open, but rather, you could say, your eyes are wide shut. Just as a Lutheran example, right? Most of us, I think we're all Lutherans, or maybe didn't come from a Lutheran background, but you're in a Lutheran church now. The printing press is a technological example of the signs of the times. The printing press was developed in 1440 by Johannes Gutenberg. It was movable type. It made the printing of ideas, words, and sentences able to be easily disseminated through the world. But it wasn't for almost 100 years before at least what becomes Lutherans and Protestants actually uses it. And what's interesting, right, is that Martin Luther is not the first reformer. There were plenty of people before Martin Luther who had very similar Reformation ideas. But some will say that part of the reason those ideas don't spread is because the church of the day, or those people of the day, didn't have the tools or didn't use the tools of the day to spread their ideas. Of course, Martin Luther's 95 Theses go on the door in 1517, and it happens to be the Lutherans that start to put pamphlets out there using the movable type printing press to get their ideas across, and thus begins the Reformation, as we like to tell it as Lutherans, right? Starting directly from that time. What is the phrase, the Latin phrase that we like to lift up that Luther said? Sola Scriptura, right? That is impossible without the printing press. It makes no sense without the printing press. If you can't put the scripture in people's hands, there's no such thing as sola scriptura. The use of the times, culture changed, technology changed, the world had changed, and now the theology adjusts, the practices adjust, and hence we have the Reformation. This is a bridge in Honduras. Anyone know about this bridge? Over the Choluteca River? Is that right? It was built in 1998. Dedicated to Sarah Palin. The reality is that in 1998, it actually did span a river. And it was one of the best bridges that was ever built in Honduras. Some of the best engineers from around the world helped to build this because of the necessity of transporting goods over the river. It was, some of the best concrete. I mean, literally, it's incredibly strong. The country was proud of this bridge. And then in the same year, literally the same year that it opened, Hurricane Mitch comes along. And in about a handful of days, 100 inches of rain fell. And the landscape changed. Now, the reality is that the bridge is still a great bridge. You can still be proud of that bridge and the structure of that bridge and the engineering of that bridge, but the world had changed literally under its feet. It's not a commentary on the bridge at all. It is, however, a commentary on the world around it. Our institutions, you might say, sometimes stand strong, but in this case, sometimes also don't do us any good anymore. And that is what semiotics is all about. Semiotics is about paying attention to those rivers. It's about paying attention to the 100 inches of rain. And it's about asking ourselves the question, does this bridge serve us any purpose any longer, even if it's a phenomenal bridge? And I think now you all understand what semiotics is about. That's what we study. So, LSD to Galilee, I guarantee some of you are here just because I have LSD and psychedelics in the whole thing, and you're wondering, are there free samples? No free samples. Come on, people. Jeepers. What'd you say? Check the wafers? Somebody said check the wafers. Only a college professor would say that. So in this paper, sorry, my microphone keeps moving around on me, but in this paper that I had to write, so I'm in the first year, I have 2 years to go, so this is the kind of first phase of research and thinking, and so I decided to take a journey with this concept, this idea, LSD to Galilee, which I stole a little bit from a song written by Larry Norman in 1971, LSD to Galilee. It's a song that was playing when some of you came in. And I decided to tell the story through Time magazine's covers. So in 1966, on April 8th, which by the way was Good Friday, is when this issue was printed, Is God Dead? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. The next issue came out in 1967, in July. And it talks about the hippies, the philosophy of the subculture. And the issue after that, 1971, which is the Psychedelic Jesus, right? The Jesus Revolution, 1971 in June. And then lastly, the Evangelical Church, the New Empire of Christianity, comes out in 1977. And what I find fascinating is that in just 11 years, Time chronicles for us the question of, is God dead, to the rise of the Evangelical Church. And that, to me, is the story that I find fascinating. And so to do that, I need to talk first about the theological kind of grounding for this, and that is the idea of incarnation. All right, I'm going to... Who has that handheld mic? Let's switch. There we go. This is just getting easier. So, incarnation. And again, I'm not going to have a ton of time just to ask questions, so it's going to be very lecture style. I apologize for that, but a lot of information to cover. So, incarnation, right? The idea of God becoming human. It is the miracle, if you will, of Christmas, where God shows up and puts on flesh. Even in the word incarnation, you have carne, right? Flesh, where God puts on creation itself. In about 1050, right in the 11th century, Anselm of Canterbury writes why God became human, or why God became man. And I think he answers his very question in his introduction alone. He writes this, for what reason or by what necessity did God become man and restore life to the world? Well, that's the reason. He became man to restore life to the world, right? To do something new. And that is the purpose. Now, there's a whole other theological premise which has to do with salvation. It has to do with washing our sins clean. It has all, there's a lot of directions you can go on the theory or the reason and the hypothesis and the theologies of incarnation. But in one way or another, it's to make something new and to do something new. Terry Fretheim wrote in his commentary in the Pentateuch that God clothes God's self, right? Incarnation. God puts on creation in created reality and appears to speak. He says appears to speak, and that might be a matter of perspective. And it's the time or the place or the moment or the miracle where the finite is capable of the infinite. And so I think the best place for us in Scripture to talk about how God might be incarnate in ways other than through the person of Jesus Christ is by talking about the movie Shrek. And no, not really the movie Shrek, but specifically a talking donkey. So in Numbers, the book of Numbers, chapter 22, is Balaam and the talking donkey. I'm assuming you know something about that. Long story short, right? Balaam is a diviner, and he has this donkey, and for one reason or another, God talks, or the Spirit talks, or an angel talks, right? Depending on how you translate the text, through this donkey. And to me, what's fascinating about the book of Numbers is that it's one of the most boring books in Scripture, and yet I think one of the most profound. Because what the book of Numbers is doing, if you've ever had, who has read the book of Numbers? These are people who have very good sleep lives, because you read it and you fall asleep, right? It's that kind of thing. The book of Numbers is describing the Hebrew people outside of the Exodus, right? Here they are, they've come out of the Exodus, they've crossed the Red Sea, and in some ways they're starting to figure out who they are and how they're to operate in the world. They're counting how many people came out, and they're starting to set up the structures of their society, theologically, socially, from a government and all that. And what they start to describe early on is the shape and the size of the campsite itself, right? In the middle is the Holy of Holies, the tent of meeting. And then it describes where everyone else is supposed to be in relation to that. The Levites in the middle, which we talked about earlier, the priestly class, and then you kind of get these almost concentric circles, but it's not circles, it's rectangles that they describe on how this thing is supposed to be set up all around the tent of meeting itself until you get to the boundaries of the camp. And on the other side of the camp, on the other side of wherever that community happens to sit in those 40 years of wandering, is always defined as wilderness. It doesn't even matter if you're next to another city, it's wilderness. Because you're far away from the tent of meeting, the place where, the Holy of Holies, the place where God resides. And this is what sets up this story of Balaam and the talking donkey in the middle of the book. Because the image is that Balaam and his donkey are up on a hill, right? In mountains, if you look at other parts of Scripture, mountains are holy places. So they're up on a hill, and they can see the Israelite people way far away down in a valley. And in the Hebrew mind, the first thing they're thinking is talk about being far away from God. You're far away from the Holy of Holies, meaning the Israelite people. The Israelite people would think about Balaam. They're far away from the Holy of Holies. But the flip side of it is they're also up on a mountain. So from a perspective of proximity, they're far away from God. From legality, meaning the law, Balaam is about as far outside the law as you can get, because he's a diviner, he's a sorcerer. He can't be a righteous person. He is not close to God. There's no way this person is a holy man. So from the perspective of the law, he is far away from God. And thirdly, of course, who expects God to show up and talk through anyone other than a person? And here God shows up and talks through a donkey. So Balaam is almost the story to the Hebrew people themselves of how God shows up. Said another way, God never shows up where we think God should show up. It's repeated, if you will, in the Jesus story, right? Jesus shows up in a stable, in a manger, in the muck and in the mess, right? It's exactly where God is not supposed to be. And that is the very place where God shows up. And so that's the idea of incarnation that I'm kind of rolling with, that God shows up in the least likely of places. And so that gets us really to that first, is God dead? Now that Time Magazine article was not being prescriptive, it was being descriptive. It was describing something that was already going on in the American Christian church. Right? That it wasn't that God was dead, but what we said about God as the church was becoming irrelevant. And that's the same year that, in fact, it was just a month previous, that John Lennon said that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. The whole quote is far more interesting. Right? Christianity will go, it will vanish, and it will shrink. I think you could stop right there and say he was right. All you have to do is look at the numbers. Christianity is shrinking. Lutheran Church is shrinking. I needn't argue about that. I'm right, and I will be proven right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting that ruins it for me. He doesn't have a problem with Jesus, by the way. He has a problem with his followers. He has a problem with the church. By the way, Bonhoeffer said the same thing. 1932 at a youth conference, he said that the church is dead. He said again in 1944 when he was in prison that we are proceeding towards a time of no religion at all. I do think it's interesting that John Lennon gets chastised for saying it, but Bonhoeffer doesn't. Think about that, on how much we don't think that we are spoken to from places that are unexpected. Newsweek lifts this up in the same thing. They actually harken back to Bonhoeffer in the 1966 issue, saying the future Bonhoeffer envisioned is taking shape. That is the year that Time Prince is God dead. So that's the setup, right? That's the state of the church. The church is basically irrelevant to the culture of the day. You could say that the river has moved underneath the bridge. Make sense? So now why LSD and hippies? This is the part you're here for, I know. No free samples. So the next year, they print this article, this issue with the article inside of it, the hippies, the philosophy of a subculture. Now let's talk a little bit about LSD and what role this probably has. First of all, LSD was created in 1938 by Albert Hofmann. In 1943 is when Albert Hofmann does his first intentional test. So there was some accidental ingesting of LSD in the lab. Those stories are few and far between, but the most interesting one is this one that happens in 1943. April 19th, if you ever have heard, I didn't until I started reading this, but now I see it more often. April 19th is known as Bicycle Day. And the reason it's known as Bicycle Day is because that is when Albert Hofmann took a major, there's no tests on LSD, so he took what is now understood to be a massive dose of LSD, jumped on his bicycle, and drove home. And he had this incredible LSD trip, and he describes it as this swirling painting, and the whole, it's like a carnival, like one of those. For me, what I read, and I saw one of those, like a horror movie almost, where the world is twisting around you. But he just got it, had a major LSD trip and rode on his bicycle home, and then recorded it. And from that time forward, started doing intentional experiments with dosage, what happens to the mind, what happens to the experience. In 1963, the patent for the company he was working for ends, and all kinds of people start producing LSD, both legally and illegally. Now, the reality is that is not the first psychedelic, nor is Albert Hofmann any kind of lightning rod for this conversation. When you get into the 50s and the 60s and even the 40s before that, you have all kinds of people who you could talk about. Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, John Griggs, Aldous Huxley, Nicholas Sand, Allen Ginsberg, and you got Houston Smith, the World Religions, right? He is a part of this LSD crowd. He was connected to none other than the infamous Timothy Leary. So Timothy Leary is not necessarily the only person by any stretch who you could talk about when it comes to LSD in our culture, but again, he is very much a focal point. He is the person that Nixon called the most dangerous man in America. He is the guy that deserves a pretty bad rap, but also can be given a lot of, I don't know if the word is credit, but certainly a lot of the responsibility for the proliferation of LSD from a spiritual aspect really does come from Timothy Leary. Here's just some points I want to make about him. And his experience with psychedelics was in 1960 when he went to Mexico and had his first experiment with shrooms. And he said, I learned more in 6 hours than he did in 16 years as a psychologist. We just talked about those people, other people in the mix. He wrote a book in 1964 called The Psychedelic Experience. And this is key, to talk about this as an experience. He says, because what he's talking about not so much is the drug itself or what it does to you, but the experience you have when you take it. He's the one that says, turn on, tune in, and drop out. That is what the experience leads him to talk about. And here's a quote from the psychedelic experience that teaches us what we need to know about hippie culture. The psychedelic experience is a journey to new realms of consciousness. The scope and content of the experience is limitless, but its characteristic features are transcendence of verbal concepts of space-time dimensions and of the ego or identity. Of course, the drug does not produce the transcendent experience. It merely acts as a chemical key. It opens the mind, it frees the nervous system of its ordinary patterns and its ordinary structures. Now, I want to pause for a second and just say, Timothy Leary nor anybody at this time really could say from any scientific perspective if LSD was good or bad, harmful or not harmful. This is just the experience that these people had taking it. And these particular people, because their voice was loudest. That's all this is, right? This is not an advocating for this in any way, shape, or form. It's just what were the loud voices saying about this. And so when these stories are being told, so what we have is the advent of LSD and psychedelics. You've got a hippie culture that's being formed basically around psychedelics and LSD in particular, and that is what Time Magazine is talking about. They're talking about the hippie experience that is really grounded or was catapulted by LSD itself. And they wrote in that article that being a hippie was about doing your own thing, wherever you have to do it and whenever you want. Drop out, leave society as you have known it, leave it utterly. Blow the mind of every straight person you reach. Turn them on, if not to drugs, and I think this is fascinating. If not to drugs, turn them on to beauty, love, honesty, and fun. Just turn them on. So it's not that these people were entirely pushing drugs or LSD. They were pushing a new outlook, a new way of life, a different perspective. A quick story about some of these people. This is Nicholas Sand on the upper left. He's the creator of what's known as Orange Sunshine. Now, I don't know what your background is, depending on your age, but Orange Sunshine is pretty much known as the most popular, most prolific, most highly produced form of LSD that ever existed. It was the form of LSD that brought Johnny Griggs and Timothy Leary together in the lower left. And if you don't know who Johnny Griggs is, he was the founder of what is known as the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. The Brotherhood of Eternal Love was formed in Laguna Beach. John Griggs took LSD for the first time, and in his mind, in his words, he would say he was turned on, he saw the world differently. It was a spiritual experience. And that is key. This was a spiritual experience for Johnny Griggs, and they formed this group called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Their goal was to turn on the world, and to do it for free. This is how much they believed in this. For them, this was a religion. You can't overlook that. I mean, it feels like from the outside it's a bunch of druggies doing a bunch of drugs. For them, this was church. And they wanted to turn on the world so badly, they thought it would change our perspective on war. They thought it would change our perspective on finances. They thought it would, all of those kinds of things. And so they wanted to turn on the world for free. So this group, Brotherhood of Eternal Love, under John Griggs, decided they're going to do it for free, except for there's a problem with that. The problem is that it costs money to make drugs. So how did they fund it? They funded it by going to Afghanistan, getting hash, smuggling it into the United States, selling it to druggies, using the money to buy all the ingredients and pay for labs to create Orange Sunshine for free and distribute it for free. That's how they believed in it. By the way, Brotherhood of Eternal Love is to this day the largest drug smuggling cartel the U.S. has ever seen. They finished tracking them down late 90s, early 2000s. It is this reason that marijuana, at the time, was put on as a Schedule I drug. Not because of what it does, but because of what it funded. They needed the political might to crack down on it so they could, in turn, crack down on LSD once it became illegal. There's a great documentary on, I think it's Amazon, I don't remember if it's free now or not, called Orange Sunshine. In it, one of the people of that day said this pursuit of the psychedelic experience wasn't simply about a great drug trip. It was a spiritual endeavor. It was, for many, a spiritual act. The search for that experience was a way of life. This is what defined the hippie. Now, granted, as time goes on, hippies become much different. But at that time, the hippie was the one who was in search of that experience. Think Timothy Leary's 1964, the psychedelic experience. The experience that turns you on, that sees love as being more important than the rules. That's where these people were coming from. Oops. In this book, Richard Busterin said it was a religious movement, meaning the hippie movement, that was the antithesis of skeptical atheism or agnosticism. In other words, this was the cultural counterpoint to what the article on Time magazine was talking about. Is God dead? Maybe, but spirituality exists. And in this culture, it was through the hippies and through the psychedelic culture. Goes on to say that, and specifically about how this group and how hippies kind of proliferated, and I'm going to go real quick through some of this because we're going to get tight on time. But the question is how does this, if it weren't just about drugs and LSD, meaning if you can't turn them on to drugs, turn them on to love, turn them on to beauty, turn them on to fun, how does this movement spread? It was spread through music, almost certainly. Music was the primary medium for the rapid spread and assimilation of hippie values to the under 30 generation. The fact that what had been called an alternative, subversive, and countercultural form of music could, within a few years, be classified as a genre of American pop music indicates how music was an effective medium for rapidly diffusing hippie values to the mainstream. And so what are those particular groups? Well, you all know them, right? You've got the Grateful Dead, you've got the Beatles. If you don't believe me about the Beatles, just look at Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Look at the cover and then you know they were doing something. You've got Jefferson Airplane, you've got the Stones, you've got Bob Dylan, you have Joan Baez. All of these people were part of that movement. And all of them have been quoted as talking about how powerful their LSD experiences were for their for what they call their spirituality. Of course, the hippie movement and the LSD movement kind of culminates with Woodstock, and then it kind of really quickly goes away. It was almost a flash in the pan. Now, the clothing wasn't, the cultural influence wasn't, but the actual people you'd call hippies kind of climbed quickly, hit Woodstock, and then in about 5 to 6 years, right by the mid-70s, it's not quite the thing it was. It was a flash in the pan as a group, that could be identified as a cultural group. But something happened within that real quick LSD hippie culture that is the part that I find very, very interesting. Now, when you get hippies and LSD and Christianity, it's when you get what are known as the Jesus people. You want to hear the Jesus people? Pastors probably heard Jesus people before, maybe not. That is exactly who this 1971 article is talking about with the Jesus Revolution. It used to be called, this article, which I think is interesting. I have the paper copy of it, and inside of the article itself is called The New Rebel Cry, Jesus is Coming. But in its now online version, the article is identical, but the title has changed, probably to a culture that can swallow this a little bit better than it could in 1971, The Alternative Jesus, the Psychedelic Christ. They've renamed it somewhere between then and now, probably because this is a little more entertaining for a 2020 culture. I don't know when they actually did it. Question is who are these Jesus people? What happened? What happened in this hippie culture that ended up turning some of them to Jesus people? Well, I'm going to make a very long story very short. As the music, if you will, of the hippie culture will back up. First of all, hippies are seekers, right? They're looking for something. They're looking for this experience. They got this experience through the LSD life, a spiritual life, even by those who weren't Christians or really following any kind of formal religion. They were looking for some kind of spirituality. At some point, there wasn't a structure at the end of the road. They found that they were, and here's something we hear today, it started in the 60s and 70s, I'm spiritual but not religious. This is where it starts. I'm spiritual but I'm not religious. It's not that it starts there, it's where its language comes from. And so some of them end up, finding Jesus. And what's interesting is how many of the churches in the areas that this stuff was happening were specifically reaching out to this group. Jesus Revolution was a breath of fresh air as it came about in the midst of other social revolutions, the civil rights revolution, political, sexual revolution, the advent of the pill, and of course the psychedelic revolution. It's the Jesus Revolution that was a breath of fresh air. There's an uncommon morning freshness to this movement, a buoyant atmosphere of hope and love along with the usual rebel zeal. Their love seems more sincere than a slogan, deeper than the fast-fading sentiments of the flower children. What startles the outsider is the extraordinary sense of joy that they are able to communicate. Now, if you haven't seen such a 180 turn in the same publication in just 5 years, when Time was talking about the church in 1966 versus when they're talking about Jesus people in 1971, This is a completely different story. They simply swapped one high for another, some say. To be high on drugs means to have a drug-induced experience. To be high on Jesus means to have a certain kind of religious experience. The common denominator, now I've got to know this author a little bit, a fascinating and quirky dude, but a great researcher, and he's got some phenomenal insights, and I'm going to read this because I think it's just worth reading. The common denominator was a transcendent experience of God that usually began along the hippie quest for truth and ended with a Christian conviction. The Jesus people were Christian experientialists. The reckless abandon that had once guided hippies to turn their bodies into laboratories of chemical and sexual experimentation were now channeled into spiritual exploration. Where hedonistic pleasures and a heightened societal consciousness were the primary goals of a hippie, immersed in the counterculture, the subsequent metamorphosis into a Jesus freak now offered individuals opportunity to be co-laborers with God. And that's what harkens us, right, all the way back to one of our first slides with Timothy Leary, right? That LSD, from the perspective of those users in the 60s, opened the mind and freed the nervous system of its ordinary patterns and structures. That's exactly what these hippies were talking about, even when it came to Christianity, right? Even when it came to the institution of the church, that there was something in that experience that helped them see beyond the structures that Time magazine was saying was inhibiting the joy and the love that maybe should have been present in the church. So light speed here. What this means is at that time, between 1966 and 1971 or so, all kinds of hippies turned Christians popped up these ministries up and down the coast of California. There were other examples around the country. It's just, if you want to look at how many, like, what is the greatest number and the greatest concentration, California is it. This is where the Brotherhood of Eternal Love were based up through 1972. This is where Sunshine was produced, and this also happens to be where most of these churches started. Arthur Blessed's His Place, Tony and Susan Alamo's Christian Foundation, Donald Williams' Salt Company nightclub, David Berg's Teens for Christ, that turns into Children of God, which is better described as a cult than a church. Ted Wise's Living Room, a coffee house. So the whole idea of coffee houses really is a bunch of hippies trying to make a living on the other side of being a hippie while they want to minister to people. And this is the group, this last group, Ted Wise and the Living Room, that coffee shop, that runs into a young man named Lonnie Frisbee. Who has heard of Lonnie Frisbee before? Figured you would. Lonnie Frisbee was born in 1949 and died in 1993. He was basically on the streets, whacked out on LSD, preaching Jesus. Then comes along, there's a lot in here I still need to research, but then comes along Chuck Smith. Does anyone know who Chuck Smith is? Of course we do. Chuck Smith is the founding pastor of Calvary Chapel. One of the absolute biggest churches we've seen, right, as a single kind of congregational entity. Chuck Smith comes out of a Pentecostal, what the hippies would call very straight, very much a rule follower. He founds what's called Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa, starts with 25 people. Within 3 years, by 1968, there's 200 people. It is in 1968 that he comes across Lonnie Frisbee, who is this LSD hippie preaching Jesus guy, very much a charismatic. Hippies follow, and so does music. With the hippies, they move from hymnody, piano, organ, and all of these little rock and roll people follow along with Lonnie Frisbee, including a gentleman named Greg Laurie, who was currently the pastor of Harvest Bible Fellowship, founded in 1973, that currently has 15,000 members. And he says this, he says, let's just say that these songs that Jesus people sang did not have a whole bunch of complexity. They were about 4 chords, simple lyrics, repeated again and again, and in spite of the simplicity, or maybe because of it, the songs intrigued him. The kids weren't singing for themselves, it seemed like they were singing to someone. That was strange. The music comes along, Calvary Chapel brings those the hippies in their music along with Children of the Day, Children of the Day, Country of Faith, and Love Song. In Frisbee's first summer, 1968, 500 converts. You're talking about a church of 200 people. Picks up in one summer 500 new people. And within 2 to 4 years, Calvary Chapel was worshiping 1,500 people with Lonnie Frisbee as the lead preacher. And that 1,500 people that show up doesn't include Sunday evenings, Tuesday evenings, Wednesday evenings, Thursday evenings, or Friday evenings, where they had additional services. Chuck and Lonnie Frisbee started doing baptisms, public baptisms, show up and be baptized right there in Costa Mesa area, in the Pacific Ocean, where hundreds and thousands of people would come to be baptized. I mean, look at that. This is just within a couple of years, as the hippies were seeking, and they're looking for their experience, and they were looking for something. By 1974, Calvary Chapel built a 2,300-seat auditorium, and within 5 weeks, they had to increase to 3 services. Why should the devil have all good music was the mantra. You don't know who said that first? Martin Luther. When he was asked why you are putting religious words to bar tunes, his response was, why should the devil have all the good music? That was the mantra of hippies in the 70s. Why should the devil have all the good music? Enter the last Time magazine, the Empire of Faith, Evangelicals, the New Empire of Faith, sorry. Oops. Go back. So George Harrison, 1971, releases My Sweet Lord, which is not a Christian song, but it is influenced by that same hippie LSD culture, right? My Sweet Lord, coming from a Beatle, and singing about Hare Krishna, singing about, there's all kinds of stuff mixed in it. But this is an example of what we're talking about, because I don't know how well you guys know music. 1 chord, 2 chords, back, again, 1 chord, 2 chords. That's it. That's the song. 2 chords, the whole thing. It goes up to the next register in the bridge and comes back down again. It is the epitome of the simple song. It goes like what we call triple platinum today. It's a global phenomenon, and it is those hippies were singing My Sweet Lord, even if they weren't particularly religious, but they all were spiritual. Why should the devil have all the good music? Kylie Ward writes about, she's out of Detroit, the preoccupation of the Jesus people with new music. Rarely do you hear any of the old-time hymns. The Jesus people all write their own. To the children of the spiritual 60s, nothing was more singularly important than their addiction to music. And it's from here that launches, October 1st of this last year, Amy Grant produced a documentary called Jesus Music. This is where Jesus Music picks up. So I'm looking into that moment before, but Jesus Music literally picks up right where we are. It picks up at the founding of all of the evangelical music kind of groups. It starts with Love Song, which was the band, one of the bands at Calvary Chapel that experienced all the growth, to Larry Norman, who is a very controversial person, kind of a dirty person, but he wrote all kinds of really pretty phenomenal music, really crappy theology music, but really good music. And then literally within 10 years, you've got Amy Grant. This moved from being Jesus music to CCM, or Christian contemporary music. One particular publisher you probably have heard of, comes directly out of Calvary Chapel, is Maranatha Music, founded by Chuck Smith, because he met Lonnie Frisbee, who was whacked out on LSD, including Maranatha praise music. I bet $100 right now that we've got these in this church right now, somewhere, guaranteed, right? Songs like Father, I Adore You, Seek ye first the kingdom of God. Hallelujah. That's a LSD hippie song, guys. Straight up. There's no way you can say it any other way. It comes directly. Father, I adore you. Lay my hands before you. Right? All the way back to Albert Hoffman, who says, I did not choose LSD. LSD chose me. And maybe the LSD chose the church. And what I mean by that is this. There's not anyone in the church world at the time who would have said that's where God was. That God might have been working through those people. Almost nobody would have said that. And yet, out of it comes one of the most powerful, whether we agree with the theology or not as Lutherans, which I guarantee we don't, but it is really, 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 really hard to discount what happens to some of those churches. It's really, really, really hard to write off what happens and has been happening when it comes to recovery ministries, when it comes to getting people passionate about learning about God, learning about Jesus, joining a community. What I find the most fascinating about all of this, right, goes all the way back to that Numbers 22 story of Balaam and the talking donkey. That the one place where the Hebrew people would have said God was not would be outside of the walls of the tent, would have been working through a diviner, a sorcerer, and talking through an animal. And I would argue that possibly the one place that the church described in Time magazine in 1966 that said God is, asked the question, is God dead? The place that those church people at that time would have last looked for God would have been in an LSD community up and down the coasts of California. So a lot more research to do, but that's where we're at. It's that in that connection, right at the formation of CCM, Christian Contemporary Music. What is it that leads us there that I'm most interested in from that perspective of the Incarnation? So we have very little time, but questions? No, not necessarily, no. Good question, though. Yeah.
There was one slide that talked about it. It was a quote, and he said Jesus freak. Do you think he intentionally called out to use the term Jesus freak to capitalize to kind of play on the current counterculture in 2004 with DC Talk and that song?
Right. So the question was about the capitalizing of the term Jesus freak. I would say so, because there were all kinds of terms for those people before, that was being listed: street Christians, drug Christians, all this kind of stuff, and Jesus freaks. Jesus freaks has been commercialized by DC Talk and by some other people, so it probably does play into that and why that was capitalized in that way. And that's also where Jesus freak comes from, right? It comes from a 70s usage of the Jesus freak.
Okay.
Well, just two kind of, I think, connected, but quick thoughts. The one thing that you did not have in your presentation was Vietnam.
Yes.
Which was a powerful influence feeding into this. And
Yep.
I think that has to be included in the study.
And I would say, there's actually a ton, right? You don't have anything about civil rights, right? There's nothing about Vietnam. There's nothing about women. There are all kinds of things happening in the 60s that are a part of this story, absolutely. I intentionally didn't put it in there because, I wanted to kind of go there, and I was advised not to because it starts bringing me down a rabbit hole that certainly influences things, because the other thing that could be said is the use of psychedelics influencing those things. In fact, can the same thing be said about all those other movements? Are they psychedelic influenced? Or influenced by psychedelics? And your second thought?
But the second thought is, rather than thinking of spiritual or religious, I wonder if, from my view, I was in university back in the
Right.
80s, and the idea of not as much religious or spiritual, but transcendent.
Yeah.
Seeking the transcendent reality that the drugs and stuff brought to mind,
Yep.
or some certain way like that. And I'm intrigued with that part.
Yeah, the question was about transcendence versus experience, and the only reason I stuck with experience was just because of some of the sources, like Timothy Leary's psychedelic experience. But transcendence is absolutely part of the conversation.
Well, the joke is, if you remember the 60s, you weren't there.
If you remember the 60s, you weren't there. That's for the live stream.
My other question is, in 1958, John Lager, the Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, published a book on the sacred mushroom and the cross. Are you playing with that work? I'm very loosely, superficial. Well, he argues that the Jesus movement began with a group of people who ingested psychedelic mushrooms and grew along the shores of the Sea of Galilee.
So he's talking about a book that talks about the Jesus movement begins with a psychedelic mushroom that grew along the Sea of Galilee. I should take a closer look.
Yeah, we'll talk.
Yep. Yes.
In your research, are you doing any kind of qualitative interviews with people who have experience?
I have done some, and I need to do a lot more. So I've probably talked to probably notes on 8 to 10 people at this point who were there, so to speak, whether they were connected to the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, whether they were connected to Calvary Chapel back in the day. So I've had some of those. Some of this direction is influenced by that. I mean, a lot of it, for most of those people, they have said in one way or another that LSD opened their mind to a spiritual experience which led them to happen to be Christianity. Like, they would say that without LSD, they don't see themselves in the church. That it was, just as the leader said, it wasn't the drugs, it was the freedom that the drugs gave their mind to see something more. That is kind of the tone and tenor that some of them, most of them would say.
And the early 70s, there was a movement within the Lutheran Church about the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Lutheran Church and Holy Spirit were conventions and Catholics and all that. I just wonder if some of that is down the road when we get from this experiential.
The question or the comment is about the Holy Spirit movement within the Lutheran Church and how much of that might be influenced or a part of or parallel to some of what I was talking about. And I don't know. That's a good question. All right. One more. And then I have to go preach. All right. Go in peace and serve the Lord.